Good morning, everyone, to the webinar on the importance of the Cape Flats Aquifer, on managing and protecting the aquifer for the future of Cape Town's residents. We're very pleased to see so many participants so far. Hoping some more will join. And I'm told the people who registered include people from academia, non-profit organizations, the private sector and the public sector. So we're very to see the diversity of participants in today's webinar, and a very warm welcome to you all. Before we start, I'd like to say a very special thank you on behalf of the PHA and Natural Justice for making this webinar possible. We're very, very grateful. And just allow me to lay down some rules for the webinar this morning. I'm not sure if you, as participants, are able to unmute your mics and have your video switched on. But if you can, please just keep them switched off for the duration. If you have questions, please do put them. I will take them down. We'll put them to the panelists during an answer session. And let me engage in in collaboration with the farm, horticulture farm in the heart of the horticultural area. So please come in with some good music.
Sorry about that. It seems that my time has dropped off, possibly bandwidth issues. I would like to just ask Alan if he would be open to starting his presentation just in the meantime. Thank you.
Sure. Martijn was going to share my presentation, but let me see if I can quickly access my slides.
Thank you, Alan. And just to introduce you to everyone, Alan is a colleague of mine. He is an attorney and works in the defending rights stream at Natural Justice, working on things like litigation and legal empowerment with communities. So welcome, Alan. Thank you.
Oh, here's Martijn. He's back. Martijn, can you hear me?
I can. Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. So I was just shortly introduced. So I'll kick us off. But yeah, as Claire has said, hi everyone. My name is Alan Basajasubi, and I am a program officer in our defending rights stream here at the Natural Justice Cape Town office. And my slide will basically be addressing why the aquifer is important and what is the human rights perspective on why the aquifer is important, why it needs to be protected from a human rights perspective. So just as an intro, we have a small little picture graph here, which kind of depicts the aquifer and just some known facts. It's from False Bay to South Tygerberg Hills, and it extends itself and covers more than 400 kilometers of square space, which is equivalent to more than 56 football fields. And the Cape Flats Aquifer is particularly important because it is the heart of what secures the water security in Cape Town, especially considering that we've come from the historical day zero in 2018, where there was a big water crisis. Scientists suspect that as the temperatures increase due to climate change, the reliance on groundwater is likely to increase, particularly given that we will be experiencing things like droughts and floods, which will mean that the accessing of the Cape Town aquifer will really be an issue that we need to primarily focus on and ensure from a human rights perspective. Next slide, please. Now, it's very important to understand what the benefits of the aquifer are. So the aquifer plays an important role in building resilience for Cape Town, given the increasing climate change impacts. And as scientists have predicted, temperatures in Cape Town are expected to increase by 1.9 degrees to 2.3 degrees for the period of 2014 to 2016. This will obviously increase the pressure on the groundwater resources, which will then obviously worsen as droughts become more frequent. Now, Cape Town is obviously aware of this, and Cape Town is in urgent need to improve its water resilience. And the Cape Town Flats Aquifer could be a part of that resilience. And so it's important to understand that from a human rights perspective, human beings who need access to this water are well in position to be able to use particular rights in the Constitution that can be used to enforce this important resource. And just to highlight what those particular rights are, we've got the rights to water, which is outlined in section 27, the right to environment, which is outlined in section 24, the right to food, which is also outlined in section 27, and the right to culture and heritage, which is outlined in section 31. Next slide, please. Now, we need to understand that the aquifer isn't something that is an accessible resource on its own. It's connected to standing from a human rights perspective. It's imposed three main obligations on state parties, which are designed to complement each other. That is the right that state has to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the rights. Now, these rights can be disaggregated into different tiers: the right to facilitate, to promote, and to provide, which is very clear as it's outlined in the Bill of Rights, particularly as in the sections 24, the right to environment, and section 27, 1B, which is the right to sufficient food and water. The South African Constitution also states that everyone has the right to have access to sufficient food and water. So water is an essential for our survival and must be protected. So the Cape Flats Aquifer is always seen as a water source that holds as much water as Cape Town's big 6 dams. Now, climate change will most likely make droughts more common, meaning that events like day zero could occur once every 15 years. And so it's important to understand that the aquifer can provide Cape Town with at least 10-year water supply during drought conditions. Therefore, protecting the aquifer means protecting your right to clean drinking water, even as climate change makes droughts more frequent. Next slide, please. I'm just going to quickly outline a number of the different rights that we have in terms of how it's connected to the aquifer. And so we'll start off with basically the right to environment. So in this right, the right is enshrined in the Constitution, and basically outlines that South Africans have a right to environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being, as well as an environment that is protected for the benefit of present and future generations. And this is very key given our scenario with climate change that is coming, and obviously climate change will have an impact for future generations. It is very important, therefore, under this right, that the Cape Flats Aquifer must be protected as a valuable environmental resource, which means that measures must be taken by government and private institutions to prevent pollution, ecological degradation, and to promote conservation of aquifers, water, and biodiversity. In the years to come, climate change will threaten this right, as well as your children's right to water and food. So it is especially important that the aquifer is protected and preserved for the benefit of future generations, as the Constitution requires. Next slide, please. The next right that is connected to protecting the aquifer is the right to food. Related to the right to water is the right to access to sufficient food. COVID-19 pandemic has showed us how fragile and inadequate the food system is. Access to sufficient and healthy food is fundamental for our survival and protecting our food sources, therefore ensuring it's local and accessible. And this will be important for the future. It is clear that with the PHA, farmland being very closely connected to the aquifer, that this farmland lies on top of the aquifer and is drought-proof, supplying the farmland with sufficient water resources in order to enable farming. So even as droughts occur more frequently with climate change, the land will still be able to produce food for Capetonians. Therefore, it's important that as part of the right to protecting the right to food, protecting the aquifer protects this drought-proof local farmland, protects your right to food. The land tenure rights and water rights are very central to the realization of human rights, such as the right to food and the right to water. And therefore, they are closely connected and therefore need to be protected. The next right that we need to look at in terms of its connection to the aquifer is the right to heritage and culture. So in our Constitution, it basically states that everyone has a right to use the language and to participate in the cultural life of their choice, and that no one can be derived the right to enjoy their culture, practice their religion, or use their language. South Africa's National Heritage Resource defines a heritage resource as any place or object of cultural significance. The National Heritage Resources Act also protects living heritage, such as cultural traditions, skills, techniques, and popular memory associated with certain places. And it is in this way that the Cape Flats Aquifer represents a heritage resource, which is worthy of protection because of its historical and cultural significance to the communities in the PHA and the surrounding areas, as well as a living heritage that is associated with current uses and utility. The Cape Flats Aquifer plays an important role in Cape Town's broader groundwater heritage, also known as the hydroecological heritage. You would have heard that there are a number of different ethnic communities, such as the Khoi, which has been referred to Cape Town as the Kamisa, the place of sweet waters, because the Cape Town Aquifer represents springs at the base of Table Mountain. And over the centuries, the availability of water in Cape Town has fueled and shaped the development of the city and numerous industries. The farmland on top of the Cape Town Flats Aquifer also has heritage significance. The Cape Flats have served as the grazing grounds for Khoi herders for over 2,000 years. And obviously with the arrival of the German settlers, smallholder farmers began to produce vegetables and other produce, a role this land still plays today. And therefore, the unique smallholder farming practices that are used in the Cape Town Flats Aquifer represent an aspect of living heritage that should be protected for many centuries and generations to come. Next slide, please. Now, we need to understand that outside of the national human rights frameworks that protect the rights of human beings to the aquifer and the aquifer itself, we have international and regional instruments that do the exact same thing. I just want to highlight what those two international conventions are. And that is the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Wetlands Convention. Both these conventions provide soft law guidance on useful elements to better understand and to advocate for environmental sustainability as a precondition for the right to water, the right to food, and aquaculture for local indigenous communities. These is facilitated through the ecosystem approach, which basically hinges on the ideas of the prioritization of conservation and sustainable use of vulnerable ecosystems. Another way of understanding this approach is what we like to call at Natural Justice biocultural rights. And in essence, biocultural rights aim to protect local ecosystems. The goal of biocultural rights is best achieved by securing the rights of communities who live within the environment and who use and sustain the environment and preserve and conserve it in a way that ensures the preservation for future generations. Oftentimes, these communities have lived in the ecosystem in a symbiotic way, preserving and respecting the land, and practicing traditions that honor the land, while also extracting resources for livelihoods, materials, medicines, and food. In relation to the Cape Flats Aquifer, bioculture rights provide an essential process in which communities are using these rights to recognize their long-established right to be stewards over the aquifer. And therefore, these biocultural rights enhance and protect the ability of these communities to support conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity for the aquifer. Next slide, please. Now, it's important to understand that local communities have a communal right and a duty to sustainably manage and protect the aquifer in order to ensure that they meet the needs of the present generations without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And therefore, it's essential that bioculture rights can be used as a people-led alternative to state-led solutions to the environmental crisis that we are facing. And it is our responsibility as members of natural justice to ensure that communities understand that they have access to these bioculture rights in order to ensure that they steer the interventions that are important to ensure that the aquifer is preserved and maintained and conserved for future generations in the short and long term. Next slide, please. Now, outside of human rights that are linked to the aquifer, it's also important to understand that there's a movement globally of the environment itself having rights. And in this regard, the aquifer itself having rights. Now, we've seen in the international space that there have been courts and legislators in countries all over the world that are beginning to recognize natural objects as having rights in and of themselves, which must be protected independently of human beings. These natural objects can be mountains, rivers, forests, springs, ocean systems, or aquifers. Now, the rights of nature and the laws that govern rights of nature have been implemented to protect resources that have significant biocultural, ecological, and heritage significance. And this is to ensure that they address issues such as pollution, extractive industries, and commercial development. Because of its biocultural and ecological and heritage significance, the Cape Flats Aquifer should be recognized as having its own rights, which must be protected, respected, and enforced against numerous threats against the aquifer itself. Now, this is a very novel line of thinking, one which South Africa is yet to adopt. But certainly, given the movement in the global space, there needs to be a more growing consensus that the aquifer itself deserves to be protected independently of human beings, and that itself is very important for ensuring resilience of Cape Town and ensuring resilience of South Africa in general. Next slide, please. Martin, can we have the next slide, please? Now, there are very key considerations that we need to consider when we talk about the protection of the Cape Flats Aquifer. Currently, there are a number of threats that the aquifer is facing. A number of these include the paving over the aquifer for developments, such as the recent Oakland City Development Project. We still have ongoing pollution from sewage and rubbish. There's still illegal dumping, and there's an expansion of sand mining developments happening around the Philippi horticulture area, which is expanding into the aquifer boundaries, which is leading towards loss of biodiversity and obviously the contamination of underground water. Next slide, please. And just to finalize on my presentation, I just wanted to have a few takeaway thoughts. As you all know, South Africa is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. And while the Paris Agreement does not explicitly refer to water or food in its operative provisions, it does provide within its preamble the elements of interpreting the fundamental rights that are important to protecting the aquifer and the right to food and water. And it recognizes that the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger and the particular vulnerabilities of food production systems is something that needs to be addressed given the impacts of climate change. Within the preamble, it refers to parties' respective obligations on human rights. And reading that, it can be argued that a human right to water is implied within the preamble of the Paris Agreement, as well as references to those rights that are tightly linked to the right to water, such as the right to health, and the rights of indigenous peoples and women. Given that the Paris Agreement loosely speaks to a number of these respective obligations to human rights and the impact of climate change brought on by these, it's important to understand that human rights therefore play an incredibly important and useful role in providing security and hope for this generation and future generations to come as we try to deal with climate change and its impact on our lives. Next slide.
That was your final slide.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alan, for your insights. It's very clear from your presentation that the aquifer is worthy of protection, at least from a human rights perspective. But our next speaker is going to talk about how aquifers can be protected. She doesn't really require an introduction. She is, of course, as many of you know, work in the water governance sector, nothing short of legendary. Karen Bosman. Sorry, let me just get my script right here. Karen Bosman is a water resource scientist and a leading specialist in environmental water resource and waste management and governance in South Africa. And she is currently the director of Karen Bosman Sustainable Solutions. So a very warm welcome to you, Karen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to allow you to share your screen from your side. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys today. I was going to talk about the regulatory protection in South Africa and elsewhere. And you know, I've kept my presentation to focus on that. However, I think having listened to the first presentation, I should just stand still a little bit at exactly what it is that we are trying to protect. And it's from a scientific perspective, with my foot halfway into the law, I always work in this field on the interface between law and science. And I'm trying to make sure that scientists understand the legal language, but that lawyers need to understand the technical language as well, and that we clearly understand what it is that we need to protect. Now, this is part of a paper I did for the Environmental Law Association and for the Groundwater Division of the Geological Association of South Africa. And I did it in collaboration with a lawyer and a scientist, Dr. Germarie Viljoen from the Northwest University and Dr. Fanny de Lange from the University of the Free State. And we decided to just make this presentation and discussion to ensure that we understand exactly what it is that we want to protect when we talk about the protection of aquifers. So I'm quickly just going to firstly talk about why are aquifers important from a socio-economic perspective, and then stand still and give you maybe a little bit of understanding of the two main risks that we need to protect against. And that is the risk of over-obstruction and the risk of contamination. And then looking at our current regulatory systems that we have in place to protect aquifers, and then why is it not so effective in South Africa, and what are other systems used in other countries to protect their aquifers. So in short, to begin, this planet that we live on looks like it should be called water, but in fact, the amount of water that we have is just a thin layer on the surface, and it is 1.4 billion cubic kilometers in total, of which 96.5 is saline water in oceans, and of the remaining 3.5%, 30% is underground as groundwater, and only 0.256% is found in lakes and rivers. But groundwater being an invisible resource, you regulate what you can see, and because groundwater is not so easily seen, it is the invisible resource. Most of our previous legislation and still current legislation focuses very much on the 0.256% of surface water that we can see. and not so much in the groundwater. When we look about what is an aquifer, we get the hydrological cycle that you all learned in primary school, where there's evaporation and precipitation, and then there's a runoff back into rivers. But there's also a large amount of water that seeps and infiltrates into the soil. And at the point where the soil becomes saturated, that is where the aquifer starts. So there's quite a large area above an aquifer that is not part of the aquifer, and legally not part of what Department of Water Affairs can regulate with the National Water Act. It is important to understand that whatever happens on the land will in turn eventually influence and impact on the groundwater. And if we abstract at the rate greater than what the natural precipitation can recharge, we will deplete an aquifer. So this just gives you an idea of how long does water stay in the water cycle, and where you have a surface water impact and a sewage work spill into a river, within 11 days, that is no longer visible, it's in the ocean and you can't see it. The recycling rate is 11 days. Whereas for groundwater, the rate of recycle, in other words, the time it takes for one drop of water to move through the entire cycle and fall down as rain again, is on average 280 years. And so you have certain areas known as an aquifer recharge area where high rainfall replenishes the aquifers. And then it can take years, decades, or even centuries and millennia before that water comes back out and becomes part of the evaporation, precipitation, and rainfall cycle again. Now, for this reason, because the water is so long in contact with rock underground, it takes on the characteristics of the rock in which it is held. So if you have rock that have high concentrations or levels of, for example, cyanide or arsenic, your water quality in the aquifer will also have the same quality as the rock. And for that reason, it is not so easy to say the groundwater has been polluted. Groundwater always requires analysis and may need treatment to be suitable for human consumption. If an aquifer is naturally influenced with things like arsenic or cadmium or sodium, which happens all over the country. I mean, in Barberton, for example, the natural cyanide levels is so high that if you will drink it, you will definitely die. In the Kalahari and in the Karoo, you get areas where the magnesium sulfates are incredibly high naturally, and that water needs treatment before people can use it. So in terms of the protection of the aquifer, we cannot say all aquifers must meet human drinking water requirements naturally, because it simply is not scientifically correct to want that. Aquifers also contributes to the base flow of rivers. If you go back to this picture, how it takes from the aquifer and it flows into rivers. And in especially the Cape Flats area, more than 100 millimeters per annum of the flow in rivers are direct contributions from water held in the aquifers. We also have a large number of so-called aquifer-dependent ecosystems, and that would be wetlands and certain phreatic plant species that are dependent on their survival for aquifers. And obviously, these are also areas where you will have shallow water tables. And if the water table meets the surface of land, that is when you get something called a wetland. Now, from a socio-economic perspective, groundwater is the largest reservoir of fresh water that is readily available. And some 2 billion of the 7 billion people on Earth depend on it for their water supply. It provides low-cost, drought-reliable, and high-quality water supplies in many cases for both rural and urban populations, which is vital for achieving sustainable development goals. And because it's underground, higher temperatures, higher evaporation does not threaten it, and therefore it provides resilience from the effects of global climate change. However, the replenishment is finite and limited to shallower aquifers. We can overexploit it, and we can seriously degrade the quality by certain land use activities that cause pollution, which now will cost extra money to take the pollutants out so that it can be useful for humans. This is a map by the Department of Water Affairs, which shows the utilizable groundwater exploitation potential. In other words, how much cubic meters per square kilometer per annum can we take out of the aquifers and use for our supply? And as you can see in the Cape Town's flat area, between 10,000 and 25,000 cubic meters per square kilometer, which is quite a lot of water if you are in a water deficit area. We use it after we've abstracted for a whole range of things to drink, provide for municipalities, crop irrigation, livestock watering, and industrial use. And this graph shows you the groundwater use per water management area, which shows that in the Cape Town catchments, most use are for municipal purposes or for irrigation purposes and for industrial purposes. Groundwater is the sole or primary source of water for 926 cities, towns, and villages throughout South Africa, including in the Cape Flats area. And in this graph shows areas which is totally or 100%, almost 100% dependent on groundwater for irrigation purposes. The area circled up there in red, the Dalmas Aquifer, I will show you a little bit later a small case study about how the lack of protection of that aquifer is threatening food security in Gauteng. Groundwater is potable mostly without extensive or expensive treatment in most cases. But remember, the rock influences the quality, therefore it must always be checked and tested. And it employs low-cost technology compared to surface water. How do we get to the groundwater, to the water in aquifer? With a borehole. But the borehole construction itself can impact and can affect the aquifer and the water that we take out of the aquifer. So when we talk about groundwater protection, we also need to address aspects such as borehole construction. Especially in the Cape area, we can get what we know as borehole fouling, where high iron deposits can contaminate the groundwater, and that's not as a result of pollution, but as a result of poor borehole construction. When we abstract water from an aquifer, we form what is known as a cone of depression. That is, if you put the straw into a milkshake and you suck, it will go down around the straw, and it's exactly the same principle. So over abstraction can cause dry wells on neighboring properties if one property owner abstracts too much. A number of other anthropogenic activities can also potentially place aquifers at risk. And if you think that that hydrological cycle I showed you earlier is still the way it works, it's not. Humans and our interventions have changed the hydrological cycle in every step of the way. And so we still have evaporation and precipitation, but we take water out from streams, from boreholes. We create recharge areas and recharge zones, and we create cones of depression every time we access groundwater. Over abstraction of groundwater can seriously damage large areas of development, including the socioeconomic activities in those areas. The photo on the right at the bottom is of the Aral Sea, where a ship is stranded because of over abstraction of groundwater. Excuse me. In the upper reaches, the entire feeding flows into the Aral Sea and has disappeared. And the aquifers was damaged to such an extent that there is no longer an Aral Sea, and you can go down a rabbit hole and Google that tonight. A large number of over abstraction can also cause the land surface to drop. That is known as subsidence. And in certain areas where you especially have dolomitic karst aquifers, you can find sinkhole formation where the soil literally falls away. And in the far west rand, sinkhole formation has sterilized the entire area that it's no longer suitable for housing development. And the pipe you see on this photo is the Wonderfontein Spruit, which had to be piped across about 50 kilometers so that it doesn't add to more sinkhole formation and that the water is not lost. If we make rules to regulate groundwater, we are often try to make those rules very simple and minimalistic and rule-based. For example, no septic tank within 50 meters from a borehole. But if you look at the top example, the septic tank is 100 meters from the borehole, and yet because of the geology, the septic tank directly impacts on the drinking water borehole. In the second example at the bottom, this geology and the septic tank there is much closer. Drops its load into the Vado zone where it's useful and not into the aquifer itself, and there's no impact on the borehole delivering clean drinking water. So one has to understand the science quite well in order to understand how to regulate it. And for groundwater, it will always be site-specific, because I can literally walk 10 meters and be on top of a completely different aquifer. A large number of land-based activities can influence and can impact on groundwater, including as a mine waste, drainage, fertilizers and pesticides from agriculture, septic tanks, animal husbandry, large-scale use of fertilizers, garbage sites, waste disposal areas, gas tanks and leaking underground storage tanks is a great concern, especially in urbanized areas such as the Cape Flats, because there's very little control over the leaking underground storage tanks at filling stations, and so on, salt tanks, fuel tanks, etc., as well as factories and industrial premises. There's a number of factors, as I said earlier, that influences groundwater quality, not just the activity of humans. And that means that we simply cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to aquifer protection. This map shows the potability of South African groundwater based on salts. And from this, you can see that while in the Cape Flats area, your salts is in this area a range of 70 to 150 millisiemens per meter. In the Northern Cape, it can be above 500 millisiemens per meter naturally. And the same goes for nitrates. Now, nitrates is of particular concern or importance because nitrates leads to a disease known as methemoglobin anemia or blue baby syndrome. And any sewage pollution, any over-fertilization can increase the loads of nitrates. However, in certain areas of the country, nitrates do occur naturally as a result of the presence of certain minerals in the geology. And therefore, one can again not just assume that water quality is suitable for human consumption. This map shows you the fecal pollution in our aquifers, and it shows that especially the Cape Flats aquifer has been quite severely contaminated with fecal pollution, which is a direct result of poor sanitation and poor sanitation practice. To summarize, the protection of groundwater should be a high priority in South Africa, but we need to understand very clearly what it is that we want to protect. And there's two aspects in relation to that. And that is prevention of over-abstraction, ensuring that there's sufficient replenish the aquifer, and preventing unnecessarily anthropocentric impacts on the aquifer. In terms of our regulatory systems that we have, because aquifers, water are public goods, we need to have it protected for the benefit of the public. However, the risk of pollution arises from legitimate activities within society. We cannot say, don't have sewage works because it causes aquifer pollution, or don't have pump stations because it causes aquifer pollution, or don't have sand mines because it causes aquifer pollution. All those activities are legitimate activities. What we need to do is ensure that the management measures are in place, that those impacts can still be managed. And from an aquifer perspective, groundwater perspective, we simply cannot have rule-based approaches. We must have site-specific, risk-based approaches. And such an approach was followed under the old 1956 Water Act, where although water was regarded as private water, which didn't imply a right to own, but a right to privately use. And the same in the new act, you have the right to use. Although that was the case, the government declared 16 subterranean aquifer protection zones between 1956 and 1994. The extent of those were quite limited, and it only prevented effects from over-abstraction and did not consider land use activities. And if you look there at the Cape Flats area, there were at least 6 of those zones in that area which are still in force, but only as exempted area under some general authorizations. And the enforcement of the protection of these protection zones has not continued under the new Water Act. What we have under the new Water Act is the concept of resource-directed measures, which says we must classify water resources, and for each significant water resource, establish resource quality objectives, which could relate to both quantity and quality. This, however, in the implementation and development of the methods of the Department of Water Affairs, really focused mostly on surface water and not so much of groundwater. And the promulgation of certain resource quality objectives did not even mention the subterranean government control areas that had been established under the preceding legislation in those catchments. So this resource-directed measures was ultimately aimed to protect aquatic ecosystems. But very much of the groundwater resource that we have and that we can use in the future are very deep and do not support aquatic ecosystems. So the overemphasis on aquatic ecosystems actually led to a lessened protection or a lower protection of aquifers. And this is the case study in Delmas, where the people have been using dolomitic good quality water for many years. But because of lack of sanitation and poor management by the municipality, there was a 2005 outbreak of cholera. And as a result, 3,000 people were hospitalized and 9 people died. In 2020, an application for a mining license to mine coal has been approved. And this water from the aquifer is used for large-scale irrigation of especially vegetable crops. It's the vegetable garden of Gauteng. More than 75 such privately boreholes were identified. And it predicted in the mining application that concentrations will reach up to 1,200 milligrams per liter only after 25 years. Blasting of the shale will also shake loose the suspended solids in the aquifer itself, the so-called wadi. And this was not even identified as an impact during the EIA process. Although dolomitic aquifers are especially prone to sinkhole formation and subsidence, these aspects were not addressed as possible risk during the mining activities. And the result was, and this is just some maps, this show you the blue area, that's the dolomitic aquifer that is so vulnerable there at Delmas. And all those red spots are the currently used large-scale abstraction boreholes used for the vegetable irrigation. And in spite of that, this is what the sulfate plume prediction shows, how many of those boreholes will be detrimentally impacted and affected. And approaching the Department of Water Affairs was not effective. They simply said, but we don't have the power to do anything about it. So that raises the question, why is our current regulatory protection of aquifers not effective? And there are a number of gaps that we've identified. Firstly, the overemphasis of biodiversity and the ecological reserve at the expense of basic human needs, which places the focus too much on surface water, and it does not protect aquifers of socioeconomic importance. No consideration of existing subterranean government protection, groundwater protection areas, no mechanism to classify aquifers, and we cannot amend resource classifications once they've been promulgated. We also do not see any compulsory licensing in areas where there's high aquifers of high socioeconomic importance, and there's no special consideration for even currently declared subterranean government control areas. Under the EIA and EMPR requirements, there are no compulsory peer review mechanisms, and the evaluations are done by inexperienced officials who make recommendations to ministers whose objective is to promote mining, and ineffective appeal processes which do not regard serious socioeconomic impacts on especially agriculture and consequently food security as significant. And this means we do not currently properly protect our sensitive aquifers that are appropriately and that are important from a socioeconomic perspective. So how do we address these gaps? In certain other countries, the concept of an aquifer protection zone has been established, where regulatory control is placed on certain activities taking place on land that overlies vulnerable aquifers or the recharge zones of such aquifers. In essence, a subterranean government control area that we have in South Africa is an early type of an aquifer protection zone. And in these other countries, it's normally achieved through legislation used for land use planning. They all normally have 3 different types of zones per each aquifer, and with each protection zone, various levels of land use constraints are imposed and are more stringently the closer you come to the borehole operational zone. So you will have a wellhead protection zone immediately adjacent to the site of the well to prevent rapid ingress of contaminants, an inner protection zone, which is based on the time expected to be needed for a reduction in pathogen presence, especially things like E. coli, which is a problem on the Cape Flats, and then an outer protection zone, which is based on the time expected to dilute and effectively attenuate slower moving substances, as well as to identify and implement remedial intervention. And further, much larger zone sometimes covers the recharge area of a particular aquifer, especially when you abstract water for potable purposes in order to avoid the impacts of depletion of the aquifer or over abstraction. The extent of each zone must be determined based on the site specifics using recognized scientific measures. And it's not just based on a thumbs up. So it's rule-based, not risk-based. And we cannot simply say, oh, we must have these rules for the entire Cape Flats aquifer. We must be specific about what kind of rules do we want in which area. And these are typical examples of the constraints. For example, in the inner protection zone, you will not have cattle kraals or feedlots or sewage sludge or pit latrines or mining. And in the outer areas, you will not have things like waste disposal sites, chemical plants, oil refineries, and hazardous waste storage underground. We can implement these aspects within the South African legal framework, and I'm almost at my conclusion, because groundwater relates to 2 aspects, water and land, which are currently governed by separate departments. So to govern it as water, we would need amendment to the National Water Act to allow for the revision of the resource classification system, which we've already promulgated in 2011 and currently does not make provision for aquifer classification or for the identification and protection of significant aquifers. Under the land use planning legislation, the Spatial Land Planning and Land Use Management Act, SPLUMA, which is supported by provincial legislation, we can achieve the implementation of zoning areas through integrated development plans and spatial development frameworks. And the implementation of land use planning schemes is essentially saying this zone, like African aquifer protection zone, should not have certain activities. It uses zoning as a primary land management tool. And the purpose of the zoning is to say, in this area, these land uses are acceptable. And in that way, we can say, let's avoid the establishment of filling stations or feedlots within our high priority recharge zones. Zoning on a municipal level might not, however, protect sensitive aquifers because some of these things stretches across municipal boundaries. Therefore, it's also necessary to provide on a mechanism over areas wider than a particular municipal jurisdiction. In conclusion, the link between land use planning and groundwater protection has not properly been translated into control mechanisms in our South African legal framework. Declaring especially certain recharge areas as groundwater protection zone and limiting the type of anthropogenic activities that can place on these areas will facilitate the protection of certain groundwater resources. But that is difficult to achieve where the institutions involved and governments of water and sanitation, agriculture, environment, and municipal government do not always talk to each other. They operate in separate silos. Land use planning zones and regulations at aquifer level can actually be effective tools, and aquifer protection zones can be incorporated into current land use planning schemes. Therefore, it is recommended that policy documents and guidelines be drafted by geohydrologists and other relevant environmental scientists, as well as environmental law specialists, to facilitate the establishment of these zones as a matter of priority. Understanding always that we need to know what it is that we want to protect and why we want to protect it. Good environmental governance needs good environmental science, and that is why we need to integrate these two things when we talk about aquifer protection zones. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Karen. That was fascinating. It's clear from your presentation that aquifer protection is not a priority at the moment, and it hasn't been as strong as it should be. But it's also positive to note that we do have options and that we can do something about it. And our next speaker is going to talk about a program that is run by the City of Cape Town to protect aquifers in its jurisdiction. The next speaker is Kanda Lashes-Skeepers, and she is a Principal Professional Officer Geohydrology at the City of Cape Town. She studied at the University of the Western Cape, and she specializes in groundwater. And as I've said, she is involved in the City of Cape Town's Managed Aquifer Recharge Program. Before I give you an opportunity to go ahead, I'd just like to remind everybody to, if you have questions for the panelists, please put in a chat, or general chat. I will note it, and I will ask the panelists to answer the questions during the question and answer session. Questions from Mark and from Jenny Wells. And a new one just come in from Shirley. Thank you. Floor is Candice.
Can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks and good morning, everyone. So I will be presenting on the Cape Flats Aquifer Management Scheme. Just giving an overview of what the city is doing and how far we are and what type of protection we have proposed. And let's take it from there. So just a quick overview. We all know that with the drought, a few projects started to pop up within the city, and it was run under the New Water Program. This covered short-term augmentation projects, and then there were also a few permanent projects, which are more medium to long-term. And then because this is an aquifer festival, we are speaking about the Cape Flats Aquifer, but just to note that we also have the Table Mountain Group Aquifer Project and the Atlantis Aquifer Project. So in 2017, with the drought, the city received a Section 30A directive from the National and Provincial Department of Environmental Affairs. I think they're called DFFE now, or DEFF. I'm not sure. It changed so many times within this past few months. But we received a directive from them, and the directive basically says that we are kind of exempted from certain listed activities, which are listed in NEMA. Then in 2017, we also received a water use license from the National Department of Water and Sanitation, and that is for Section 21A, which is to take water. So we will be taking, or at least we are authorized to take from phase 1, 55 million liters per day. And then also in the license, it indicates that the city must recharge the aquifer. So they have indicated 3 phases, and these are the the various volumes for those phases. So just in terms of the well fields, the initial plan was to abstract from a few well fields within the Cape Flats Aquifer. So, they've identified a few areas. By they, I mean the city's professional service provider, which are geohydrologists. They identified zones that they could potentially target, and based on the exploration, drilling and testing, they eliminated some of the sites due to poor yields and poor qualities. So the well fields that the city will be and is currently developing is the Strandfontein West well field, Strandfontein North and East, Philippi, Hanover Park. Then there's Swartklip and Mitchell's Plain. Bishop Lavers was on the cards, but because of poor yields in that area, the balls have been drilled, but we've decided not to go further with that well field. So as you can see, Strandfontein West is the first well field that will be commissioned, and we are looking at March 2022, so we're nearly there. And then as you go along, we start to implement the MAS scheme between 24 and 25. And Swartklip is also one of the well fields where we've identified poor water quality, and until such time we have put that well field on hold. So when we determine or when we see that water quality has improved, water quality has improved, we will make a call as to whether we will continue with the development in that well field. So what is managed aquifer recharge? So in terms of managed aquifer recharge, it is a process whereby we use a specific source water and we intentionally or artificially inject or infiltrate it into the aquifer. So common source water used is treated wastewater or storm water. Sorry, just give me 1 sec. Apologies for that. And then also with the national water strategy and the national groundwater strategy, they talk about diversification of supply. So the city started looking at, obviously groundwater, but also using treated water. And we have been using treated water and stormwater years before in Atlantis for recharge as well. So that also speaks to diversification of supply. And then with the Cape Town's water strategy, the managed aquifer recharge project supports the city's vision to become a water sensitive city by 2030. So just looking at managed aquifer recharge, why do we do it? What are the benefits of managed aquifer recharge? So we improve that biodiversity, it's sustaining environmental flows, it's securing and enhancing water supplies, protection against saline or seawater intrusion, it's improving quality of source water, and then also there is a circular economy. So we abstract, we send to the residents, the wastewater goes back to the wastewater treatment plants, we treat it, and then we reuse it again. So it is reused and indirectly because there's a treatment process underground as well as water moves through the aquifer. So with the city's water strategy, we have 5 commitments, and that's safe access to water and sanitation, wise water use, sufficient reliable water, shared benefits for regional water resources, and water sensitive cities. So in terms of the Cape Flats Managed Aquifer Recharge Scheme, there's provide additional water into the network, so that's more water into the network for safe access for water and sanitation. And then wise use, we've got water indirect use, sufficient and reliable water, augment water supply, and then in terms of a water sensitive city, support ecosystem. Someone's mic is on and it's making a noise. If you can mute mics, please. And then also, as I've indicated with the, so the water sensitivity. So how is it done? There are various mechanisms to do managed aquifer recharge. And I've just taken this diagram, which kind of shows the various mechanisms that can be used. So there is a few, and with the city of Cape Town, we'll be using the aquifer storage, transfer, and recover method. And then the in the Atlantis aquifer, it's just important to note that we've been doing infiltration ponds for almost or over 40 years now. So managed aquifer recharge is not new. It's new in the Cape Flats Aquifer, but we've been doing it within the city of Cape Town for over 40 years. So this is just a conceptual design. We capture wastewater, then there's a pre-treatment process to very high standards. It's advanced treatment. Then we send it through the network and we inject it into the aquifer. It's a recharge, it creates a mound, and then there is a travel and storage into the aquifer, traveling time to the abstraction boreholes where the well fields are situated. Then we've got post-treatment again, and then we send it into the reticulation network and it goes back to the users. So water source, as I've indicated, the advanced treated wastewater. So you've got pre-injection treatment to achieve high water quality standards, as I've indicated. The city, through the PSPs, they've advised that we don't have these standards in South Africa, so they've used the California standards for reuse of treated effluent. And then we've got the water safety plans, which points out critical control points where we would do our sampling and indicates what type of parameters we need to sample for and look out for. And where we basically need to say, okay, we are picking up something, this is how we will respond to the specific risk. And then the high water quality standards before injection also assists with to avoid clogging in the borehole, and of course improving water quality in the aquifer, especially in areas where we do have very poor quality. So as I've indicated, there's also a soil aquifer treatment. So as we inject, we've got travel time to the abstraction borehole, and there is a specific travel time that has been used, which I think Karen indicated in her presentation, takes into account for pathogens, a reduction in pathogens. So just an overview of the managed aquifer recharge scheme that the city is busy developing, and then also where the well fields are situated. So we've got the the Hanover Park well field, Philippi well field, and then the green is your well fields, and the red indicates your managed aquifer recharge well fields. So we've got a managed aquifer injection cluster. As you can see, 3 injection clusters. We've got in Philippi, we've got in the Strandfontein area and the Mitchell's Plain area. And then we've got barrier clusters. So the recharge scheme along the coast is a saline or saltwater intrusion barrier cluster. We have another barrier cluster in Mitchell's Plain protecting the Strandfontein well fields from poor quality water in this area. And then we've also got a cluster on the side, also protecting the well fields from the Zikuflay area and any other possible contaminants on the side. And then the city of Cape Town will have one advanced water treatment plant, which is where we will get the water which will be injected into the aquifer for recharge, and then 4 decentralized water treatment plants throughout the well fields. So the PSP looked at abstraction with and abstraction without saline intrusion. Without the recharge saline intrusion barrier. So sustainably, the city can take out 20 megaliters per day from the Cape Flats or from the wellfield cluster in the center. But if we increase it to 55, we will, there is a risk that, or at least we will, in terms of the numerical model, it indicates that there will be saltwater intrusion into the aquifers. So the PSP included in the model recharge boreholes, injection boreholes, and the saline intrusion barrier boreholes, and used an abstraction rate of 55 megaliters per day, with the injection rate of 40 megaliters per day, and the risk of seawater intrusion has been reduced or basically eliminated. So what is and how does a saline intrusion barrier work? So this is just a diagram which shows no recharge. So we abstract water from the boreholes. Obviously, we are along the coast, so we are near the coastline. And because seawater is as higher density, the saline intrusion barrier moves in towards the bottom as well. Obviously, the abstraction is happening lower down. So we have the intrusion, the interface zone moving in towards the well fields, in towards the boreholes. And then if you look at surface infiltration, if we infiltrate, if we have recharge ponds along the coast, the recharge would mainly be in your upper zone. But as indicated here, you've got your interface zone, which moves, at the bottom. So the city, the outcome is that the city will do direct injection. And as you've seen, there are multiple injection boreholes along the coast, situated downstream from our well fields. And so we will be injecting the treated wastewater into these saline intrusion barriers to keep this a fresh water and saltwater interface zone, at bay. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with the groundwater protection zones because Karen did it very beautifully. But I will just kind of give you an overview of how the city, what our groundwater protection zone looks like, and how we are going to be using it. So because we are in a shallow, unconfined urban aquifer, we identified that a groundwater protection zone is extremely important. We don't have guidelines for this in South Africa. So guidelines were used from the California Environmental Protection Agency, the EU Water Framework Directive, and the Portuguese law to assist and develop the Cape Flats Aquifer protection zones. So as Corin has indicated, you've got various zones, and you've got your wellhead protection zone, which is your inner zone, and that has been set to a 10-meter radius around the wellhead or the borehole itself, that area. And then we've got zone 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it's middle zone, outer zone, catchment zone, and then the full catchment area. And they have different travel times associated with them. So it's zone 2, 2-year travel time, zone 3, a 5-year travel time, zone 4, 10 years, and zone 5 beyond 10 years. So this is basically what those zones are looking like for the well fields. And we haven't included in this diagram, in this map, one for the Swartklip area, but there is a draft protection zone for the Swartklip well field as well. So this just covers your Hanover Park, Philippi, Strandfontein, and Mitchell's Plain well fields. So Corin indicated that there's a list of potential contaminating activities, which we either which are prohibited, limited or prohibited per protection zone. So on the top, I'm not sure if you guys can see, you guys can see it. On my side, there's some zoom controls that limit me from seeing things. So you've got your zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, sorry, zone 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we've got activities that we either prohibit in that specific zone, or activities that we say require prior approval. So for example, in zone 2, we're saying that we don't want to see things like cemeteries and wastewater treatment works, mines, gravel pits, funeral services. Okay, just you can go through the list. And then with the next one, we're seeing less, there are less activities that are prohibited, and there are more activities that we're saying is acceptable, but still requires prior approval. And so how we are, let me just go, I'll speak to how we are going to use this within the city. This is just a vulnerability map. So you can see the Cape Flats Aquifer is extremely and very high, the vulnerability. So we obviously, in terms of land use activities, contaminating the aquifer, the risk is high. So just in conclusion, the final groundwater protection zone for the Cape Flats Aquifer Management Scheme is defined by a combination of scenarios, as well as considering the land use, existing land use and property boundaries where possible to ensure that all circumstances are covered under the plan phase implementation. A conservative approach was used to calculate the life expectancy of a water parcel of water, sorry, and because we don't have operational data yet. So it's also important to note that this groundwater protection zone, it's not the final protection zone. We still need to do tracer tests, which will assist with travel times. We still need to operate the well fields and do well field testing as well. So even though we've tested individual boreholes, we didn't test the well field, which could obviously give us a different yield cumulatively. So all of that data, as we start to commission the well fields, all of that data will go back into the model. The PSPs will look at it, will recalibrate their models and look at those groundwater protection zones again and see, has it changed? Do we need to update it? So just also important, we included the groundwater protection zone shape files that were provided by the PSP. We've included that in the municipal spatial development framework and the district spatial development frameworks. And it's not a yes or no tool, but it is a tool that is used to look at the aquifer and look at the well fields that we've got and basically use it as a tool to say, how do we protect this area? What can we do? What can we recommend the development or suggest that the development do to further assist us with the protection? So obviously, you know, in some areas or some places, you have an aquifer and you develop your aquifer, then you develop your town. Cape Town has been developed for years already, and now we've decided to develop the aquifer. The aquifer was always there, but we've now decided that we want to use it, and we've developed these well fields. So of course we can't say, you know, it's in this zone and yes, it's prohibited. In certain cases, yes, we do acknowledge that it cannot happen because of the risk. But in other cases, we say, okay, so what can we do to limit the risk? What mitigation measures can we put in place? We in some cases, we advise that they have monitoring data, that this monitoring data comes to the city, that a geohydrologist does a hydrogeological assessment on the data annually and is provided to the city. So we are trying to work with the developments, the proposed developments, and in protecting this aquifer, or specifically those zones where we feel is of more importance. So then just environmental monitoring and management, which further assists with the protection of the aquifer. So with the license that was received from the National Department of Water and Sanitation, it indicates that we need to have a monitoring protocol. The license also indicates that we need to establish a monitoring committee, which we have established. And it's been, these meetings have been going since 2018. The PSP developed a protocol, version 1 in June 2018, version 1.1 was updated July 2020, and then another update was done in June 2021, and this protocol was approved by the committee. So just to note that the committee is consists of internal and external stakeholders. So we've got national government, local government, provincial government members. We've got members such as Cape Nature, Sandbox, depending on which aquifer or which well field we're in. We've also got representatives from the PHA. As a few of them are currently in this meeting as well. So we've got a broad range of members, and it's important to note that the monitoring protocol is not approved by the City of Cape Town, but the monitoring protocol is approved by this committee members. And so the approved protocol was the protocol was approved in June 2021, but because of the nature of the project, abstraction from groundwater and injection, things change constantly, and with the fact that we haven't yet commissioned a well field, obviously more data will be coming in. So as we commission Strandfontein West, we will see, we could possibly see some changes, and so we'll make further updates to the protocol. We'll also start to bring in external data sets, and by external, I mean external to bulk water. So the city's biodiversity branch also does monitoring, and we'll start to bring all of that data together and integrate it so we have a more holistic picture. And then also with the groundwater protection zones, bringing that into the monitoring protocol. Yes, so that's that. And then currently the PSPs, they do ongoing monitoring, and the types of monitoring that's currently happening is groundwater levels, groundwater quality monitoring. So we've got routine monitoring according to your SAN standards. They've done contam scans. They've done 2 rounds of CEC sampling, and all of this information is obviously used to design the treatment plants and to determine what is the best treatment processes. Then we've got surface water quality monitoring, wetland monitoring, and we've got climate monitoring. So this is just, I'm not going to go into the graph. It's just an example of what the service provider gives to us at the end of the day. And then environmental management, as I've indicated, ongoing quality and quantity monitoring of the different sources. We've got ongoing site-specific ECO inspections and method statement approvals. This relates to the development of the well fields. Regular ECO audits, which are required for the Section 30 directives. Monthly health and safety audits and reports are done. The protection zones, as I've indicated, we've got it going, it's underway, we're doing upgrades. We've got the HACCP and water safety plans, which will be done for each well field. Strandfontein West is first, so that one is already in development. We are going to establish an internal water resource management team. This is for specifically to the city of Cape Town, because the managed aquifer recharge scheme falls within a number of various branches within the city of Cape Town. We need to have this internal task team so that we can integrate information and manage the aquifer as a whole holistically. And then we've got the continuous stakeholder engagement, which takes place. The very important one is the one that I've spoken about earlier, the monitoring committee meetings, which is a compliance linked to a condition in the license, and as different bodies represented there. We've got ad hoc meetings, which we've done in the PHA several times, and then we've also got other community engagement meetings, and this is also ad hoc. When we are requested, we go out, or the PSP goes out, and they represent the city. So this is just a few pictures of work that's been done. Anyone driving through the Cape Flats over the past 2 years must have seen the city very busy drilling and busy with laying infrastructure. The tank site we've got up in Philippi, and we are busy with bore chambers and cages as well. So this is, yeah. That's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Candice. Can everybody hear me? I see my connection is unstable again. You can hear me. Okay, I see Natural Justice hand. Thank you. Thank you very much, Candice, for all of that information.
Are there any specific questions? I'm just trying to go through.
Yes. So we're going to have a short question and answer session after we've given Dr. Winter an opportunity to speak. If that's okay, I have captured some of the questions, or I've captured all of them, and I will put them to you. So far, you've got the lion's share of the questions, Candice. So you can just have a look in the chat and in the question and answer chat as well to start preparing for those answers. But yeah, thank you very much for giving up time. I know you have a very busy schedule. Our next speaker is Dr. Kevin Winter. He's a senior lecturer in the Environmental and Geographical Sciences Department at the University of Cape Town. And he's also a lead researcher at UCT's Future Water Institute and an expert on urban water management. And he's going to talk to us today about nature-based solutions for protecting aquifers, and as I understood it, is sort of the water quality that gets in aquifers. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Winter. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good day to you all. I'm sure you're all zoomed out by now, and I haven't got a presentation on purpose, and I've really just got 3 points that I want to raise, and I see our time is almost up anyway, so let me raise those points. But for the moment, just while I bring those thoughts together, would you do something fun for the moment? Here's a question that you can see on your chat at the moment. Who knows the answer to this question? Those who know Cape Town very well. So what and where is the highest point or place above sea level on the CFA right now? Have a moment, take a moment just to put it into the chat box. I've got 3 silly questions just before I raise these points, and they'll be very quick as well. Some are coming up here. Okay, let me put the chat box down to everybody there. I think it only went to 1 person. Sand dunes. Any other contributions? Come on, those who are working on the Philippi horticultural area. What's the highest landmark near you? Yeah, it's interesting. And here I'm really referring to the CFA, the actual aquifer itself. So you can exclude, in this case, although the aquifer is being fed as a recharge by Table Mountain and by the watershed near to the Tygerberg Hills, for instance, and along the coastline, it's really the actual aquifer itself. And you saw a couple of those images that Candice showed to you just now. Wow, I'm interested indeed to see where you're going to with this. The highest, ultimately, the highest point on the Cape Flats Aquifer is going to be, and it's sitting at the moment at about 18 meters above sea level, but ultimately will get to 23 meters above sea level. That should give you a clue. So I'm talking about the coastal landfill park that's been developed there. And already when you see it, if you are in and around Cape Town, it's enormous already in terms of the height of that landfill site. Here's another question, and it was raised by Candice to some extent, or answered by Candice, but more importantly with Corinne Bosman's presentation. Here's the question, and I'll put it into the chat box now, going from my one screen to the other, if I can get it in there. So, if 60 millimeters of rainfall falls on the Tygerberg Hills in June 2022, next year, how long will it take for that water to reach the Philippi horticultural area through the CFA? Is it 18 months? Is it 12 months? Is it 3, 1 month, 14 days? I don't know. Anyone would like to stab at an answer? Yeah, indeed. 280 years. We saw that earlier on from Karen's presentation. 18 months. 18 months question mark. Well, I assume there's probably no geohydrologists in the room, so it's a difficult question to answer because I don't think we know. And we're still waiting on some of the monitoring to take place on the Cape Flats aquifers and from those well fields that Candice mentioned to us earlier on. And let me ask one last question, and then I'll finish off with my 2 points that I wanted to actually ask over here. And that last question is this, and let's see if we've got some idea from everyone else coming up here. Yeah, you might well be right, Karen, in terms of it will only take a shorter amount of time, between 6 to 12 months. It's slow. It's probably closer to 18 months, but we're guessing at this stage because we don't really have any thorough studies that enable us to answer that question. So here's one last question here. What's the source of saline water in the groundwater of the CFA? Let's see what you say to that. Yeah, good. So we've got the ocean, the sea. We've got obviously salinity in the sand, the Lotus River. Now we're getting maybe closer. Yeah, good. Underlying rock structures. We've got Malmesbury Shale, the very base of the settlement of the aquifer, informal settlements, agriculture, absolutely, all of those. And so from studies that we've done in a transect across the CFA, we see very little signs of saltwater intrusion in the current abstraction rates across the CFA, and particularly across the Philippi horticultural area. There's no sign of seawater ingress the closer and closer you get to the coastline, in other words, in the current structures and infrastructure that's involved in abstracting water and so on. It's much further northwards and northwest in the CFA, where the salinity is a lot higher. So I want to, yeah, no sign of seawater ingress in the CFA. Yeah, at this stage, and of course it might be different if more abstraction starts to take place. I wanted to raise just 3 points, and the first two are largely captured already in the conversations. But I simply want to emphasize this one. If we're going to protect the CFA, we're going to need to make sure that the data and the monitoring becomes much more accessible to the public. And I use the example here of the way in which the day zero scenario was managed by the city of Cape Town. It took a little while to get there, but at some point we had, I think, and it still exists because it's every week it's updated every 2 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. We get a picture of how much water is in our storage dams for Cape Town, how much water has been used over that last week. We get some idea of the rainfall in certain catchments. We have an idea of how close we are to managing that water with a model that gives us a sense of where failure zones occur and where we are in terms of the extraction of or use of water demand and what's left in their actual storage. So it's the availability of that data is really what I'm trying to get to, and so important. I believe that was one of the things that advanced our understanding and education and essentially knowledge was the data that was presented. And remember what data does. Data, if it's properly worked by people who understand data and how to communicate data, becomes information. And that if that information becomes useful, it becomes useful knowledge that actually affects our actions, our decisions, and so on. This aquifer, if it's going to be protected, will not be run and protected solely by the city. We know that, even by the landowners themselves who are using that water, but it will be protected when we as a public begin to understand how that information is being conveyed to us. There's lots of mystery around what that water is doing under the aquifer. And you'll probably know, by the way, that next year is the World Water Day is celebrating groundwater, and it is making the invisible visible. And that is a slogan that I believe must come to the fore before for too long, so that as a public we can see, go into a website on the City of Cape Town and understand what that the state of the aquifer is doing. So protecting it by capturing data, analyzing it, reporting on it, and helping us to understand the risk, taking the emotions and the mystery out of water. Think of that slogan, making the invisible visible. That's the United Nations slogan for next year. And then secondly, we've had a lot of conversation already around protecting of the CFA as a water resource. Think of it as a large sand dam. And if it's a large sand dam that you and I are living on in the city of Cape Town, then we need to make sure that what is happening on the surface of the water is protecting the water resources further down. And you'll be amazed when you start to look at what happens to heavy metals, for instance, when they find their way into a column, into a soil column, and all the way down to the groundwater, that it stays there, that particles of phosphate stay in that sand column, and they remain pollutants in there. And so there's a massive danger and a big education, which is why the data is really important. And then last of all, as many of you will know, that I work on a site called the Water Hub in Franschhoek, and we do a considerable amount of work there in using the site as a way to trial and test our nature-based solutions. And if you want to copy down the website where our latest video is, it's in the chat box right now. And then if you want to read a little more, go and have a look at an article that we've had published this last month in October, and that gives some more detail about the recharge of the Cape Flats Aquifer, a model that we presented to the water journal, this Journal of Water Science in South Africa in October. And that might give you more detail. But I think for now, I think that's where I should stop. Everyone's tired at this stage. We've gone over time, and you can go back to those resources if you want to there. I guess the resource that I was asked to speak on really was protecting our aquifers through nature-based processes. And you'll see a lot of the things we're doing there in the video, which is essentially surface water, but it also involves the interaction between surface water and groundwater. And there's a lot still we need to learn about that. But there are, such incredible advances going on, and Candice's contribution early on shows where the city's moving. And as I always say, I'm grateful to some extent to the water crisis that we've had in Cape Town, because it's taken us into this very important area of not only just conceptualizing the aquifer and the value of that aquifer, but now starting to do something about it. And I sincerely hope that we will see the data available so that we can understand it a lot better in the course of 2022. Thanks very much for the invitation to say a few words.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate you also taking some time to come and address us today. Yeah, thank you very much. So we're going to move on quickly now to the question and answer session. I think let's quickly start with Alan. Alan has to unfortunately leave us very soon. There was one question that was asked when he was presenting, and that was by Jenny, and she wants to know what needs to happen for the aquifer to be given rights in South Africa, or a aquifer. And I would like to add to that question and say what would be the implications of the aquifer having rights? What would the implications be? Alan, do you want to have a stab at that?
Sure. These are very good questions. But to answer the first question, I think the process that I mentioned about the rights to nature approach, which is a very novel one at the moment. A lot of countries and nations are grappling with this idea of how do you develop legislation and policy that sort of affirms the right to nature as a person, or a person that's willing to be open to being protected. And obviously it's very progressive thought. There's a lot of legal scholars who are debating this particular position. And I suppose some of the difficulties around that is how do you articulate rights from a nature perspective that are equivalent to what we would understand from a human perspective. And so I think the approach of the rights to nature is a developing one. And as many of you might know, they currently at the UN, they're busy discussing whether they will add as a potential human rights crime, or not even a human rights crime, an environmental crime, ecocide, which is basically the principle as to whether harm which is done to the environment quantifies that as a right that can be tried at UN treaty bodies. And so I think you can see that from the general discussion, there's a growing consensus or a growing movement towards recognizing the rights to nature as a standalone right outside of human beings having rights to, or human rights approach to protecting their rights. And I think that is the difficulty that we find in our legislation right now, is that this approach is very difficult to define, very difficult to develop legislation and policy around. And I think the only way in which I suppose we can get to that is with growing collaboration and I suppose a growing movement of campaigns and human beings getting behind a push towards advocating for a standalone right for rights of nature, which can buttress other normal human rights that normal human beings have access to try and protect the aquifer. But it's a growing fight, one where we might see will continue to come. But I think with the growing problem and challenge of climate change, I think more and more environmentalists, conservationists, and even policymakers are trying to think around how to accelerate, protecting this right, given a lot of industry-based developments and even governments are seeming to be not swayed in trying to protect the environment. And so I think with a lot more pressure from campaigners, from human rights groups, from NGOs, and generally from the environmental movement, I think once we apply a lot more pressure on policymakers and legislators to try and sort of quantify and centralize this in our legislation and human rights frameworks, I think we stand a good stead in one day hopefully seeing that the rights of nature itself is recognized outside of just having the general human rights that are connected to protecting the environment. Hopefully that's answered the question. Not sure.
Thanks very much, Alan. It certainly does. Yeah, it's very, very interesting field of study. And Annie, I know you also for joining us today. I could pick up 3 questions that were addressed when Karen was presenting. The first one was from Mark, and it says it's been answered by Dr. Winter in the chat, but perhaps Karen, you would like to add to it. Besides the 2 risks mentioned, extraction and contamination or pollution, what about causing the aquifer to be blocked by raising floodplains to cause runoff rather than penetration, and similarly substantial increase in other off-hard surfaces? Is that also a huge risk? In fact, a growing damage rather than features. There was also a question about the supremacy of mining in our political economy in South Africa, and what we can do to address that, and also if there's any international cases that we can draw on in South Africa to improve protection of Thanks.
Thanks, Martha. And I think the blocking recharge zones. I think that was meant with the question on, if I understood the question correctly, it was aquifer to be blocked by rising floodplain. I don't really understand the question because aquifers can't be blocked by floodplains. But what can block recharge is large-scale cementation, when you cement or make big paving areas, because that prevents penetration into the soil. A floodplain is not necessarily hard. A floodplain does add to, unless you put a clay liner at the bottom of the aquifer. In terms of, I want to raise the issue which was just on the discussion here in terms of giving aquifers rights. And that's very much a northern, if we talk about the global north and the global south, that's very much a global north approach to say, oh, but aquifers must have rights, dolphins must have rights. With rights comes responsibilities. And to say, oh, but we need to give the aquifer a right because it will give us a better protection system, we don't need to give aquifers rights to achieve that. We need to implement our existing legislation better to achieve that. Because giving an aquifer a right has zero effect if we can't implement the legislation that we already have. If developers want to pave over the recharge zone of the CFA, the land use planning zone of the city of Cape Town needs to change to prevent that. And giving an aquifer a right won't achieve that. Simply changing the bylaws of the city will achieve that. And if somebody then doesn't comply with the bylaws of the city, then you need to expand maybe the enforceability of the bylaws of the city, that they can, if the city doesn't want to enforce their own bylaws, that citizens can take civil actions or even civil prosecutions to make sure that the city enforces their own bylaws. But it starts with having good legislation, and giving something like an aquifer a right will not change anything. So I just want to make that point, raise that point. There's a big push from the global north that we must give things with like dolphins and aquifers and things that are non-human, also the same rights as have humans. And then we end up in a situation exactly where we are now, where we have a large part of our population that are living in poverty, whose rights then becomes less than the rights of an aquifer or the rights of a dolphin, for argument's sake. Let's rather focus on implementing the legislation that we have and not follow the global north on their bandwagon of saying, let's give aquifers and dolphins and all kinds of non-human things rights without having the ability to implement and enforce them. I don't know if there was a second question, Martin, that I missed.
There was a question about how we can change the hegemony of mining. We have the mining industrial complex in South Africa. Sorry, I'm paraphrasing now. Please forgive me. I think it's Mark who raised the question, and to pay more attention to socioeconomic.
Well, we need to change the conversation, and somebody said it in the comments earlier that, and I 100% to agree with that, is that we need to change the ideas of governments and the civil society at large, that there's a discrepancy or a difference between surface and groundwater, and that our overemphasis on surface water often leads to us not regarding groundwater with the high importance it deserves. And it comes back to certain failures or flaws in, for example, our EIA processes, in the EMPR processes. And I've just done a review for the Lawyers for Human Rights, where a so-called scientist in the middle of Johannesburg said that this proposed mine will not cause any acid mine drainage, and he used pathetically flawed science to support his lack of an argument. Now, if there was an EIA system in which we had compulsory peer reviews of each and every EIA by an independent peer reviewer, paid for by the applicant, but appointed by communities or appointed by municipalities or even appointed by the Department of Mineral and Energy Affairs, we will have a much more robust system. And things like that won't go fast, won't go through. And we will, because, it's one thing to say, mining damages groundwater. So does municipal sewage works. So does lack of sanitation. The one is not worse than the other one. And in the same way that we say we are in a mining industrial complex, we are also in a socio-political system where we're dealing with a system that simply does not have adequate sanitation for everyone, and that simply does not think of alternative sanitations which will not detrimentally impact on our groundwater resources. So changing the conversation and saying our current EIA and EMPR system, while it's good, it's not robust enough. We need things like independent expert peer review, and that thing cannot go through unless the peer reviewers are happy with it. Changing the conversation to say, we are not opposed to any type of development, but it's the management measures that the developer implement to prevent the impacts that will determine whether he can go ahead or not. If a developer comes with more than enough and proper adequate management measures which will prevent his detrimental impacts on aquifers or surface water or whatever, by all means, let him develop. But if he comes with a half-washed EIA that does not properly address his impacts, that does not properly quantify and measure his impacts because he does not want to spend the extra money to implement proper management measures, he should fail. And that's where we need to stop. It's not necessarily just mining, it's the entire system of approval of developments with detrimental impacts without having appropriate management measures that causes impacts and damage that will last way beyond our generation.
Thanks so much, Karen. The final question was, to your knowledge, is there something that has been tried in a different jurisdiction to protect aquifers that could work in South Africa?
Well, I do think that I have addressed that in the latter part of my presentation, and it was also addressed in the presentation by Candace quite well, and it was quite surprising to me that they've looked at different types of. We looked at the UK and German systems, and they looked at the California EPA and Portuguese systems, and came up with the same type of solution. And the fact of the matter is, it needs to be addressed by land use planning mechanisms, but also by national systems as well, because local and municipal land use planning is not enough. And you can, part of the problem to say, let's go look what other countries have done and we do it exactly the same, is that other countries don't have the same environments as we do. So, for example, there's much more rain and much faster recharge in countries like Portugal and Germany, and therefore they can have things like faster natural attenuation that assist them in managing their aquifers. And in the Cape, you also get quite a bit of rain, much more than, for example, in the Karoo or in certain parts of the Northern Province, Limpopo Province. So we need to adapt our governance systems to our local conditions. Part of the reasons why we are in a problem with sanitation, for example, that is that we were at that, that's one of the things that I call environmental colonization. We were colonized by the British at that time, who picked waterborne sanitation above waterless sanitation and enforced the picking of waterborne sanitation onto all their colonies. Before 1910, South Africa had no waterborne sanitation. And other countries implemented waterless sanitation, but because we were a colony of the British, we had no choice but to also implement for waterborne sanitation, which is today causing us a lot of problems and which makes no scientific sense because you're breaking the nitrate cycle with waterborne sanitation. And so to say we need to go and look and just grab what other countries have might be to our detriment. We need to look what other countries have done and adapt it to see how it can work in South Africa under our local circumstances. And groundwater is very much localized.
Thanks so much, Karen. Yeah, those were your questions. And as I said earlier, most of the questions were addressed to Candice. I hope Candice is still with us. And apologies everyone for running the time. I know we're almost over time. But I think the presentations have been fascinating, and it's worth spending more time on it. First one is it's and he asked how can we reconcile commitment to protect the aquifer with massive urban development in place where CFA is recharged, and he specifically referred to the proposed Oakland City development. I don't know how close the department, but yeah, it'd be good to have your view on Oakland City. You also about the quality of the water that goes into the aquifer. So a lot of the participants are concerned about bad sanitation and how that impacts on sanitation services, I should say, and how that impacts on the water quality in the aquifer. And other pollutants replenishing with, for instance, wastewater and stormwater. And if the water treatment system by the City of Cape Town is able to break down persistent chemical pollutants, and what would be the implications if they're not removed. There was also a related question of what are the negative soil if the treated wastewater injected into of the treated water injected into the aquifer. And lastly, does the City of Cape Town do anything to monitor private boreholes? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I was breaking up a bit. The signal was a bit poor, so I'm not sure if I heard everything. But I also tried to read through the chat and picked up on some issues. So in terms of sanitation, there were a few questions about sanitation issues. So obviously I sit within bulk water, and we are the ones implementing and developing the aquifer. So I can't specifically speak to, what plans they have, but I will speak to what plans we have and how it will integrate their plans into what we plan to do. And just before I start, I'm gonna apologize in advance, because when life hands you lemons, I just got a whole lot of lemons. My day nanny left, so I'm sitting here with an 8-month-old on my arm. So please forgive me if she starts to cry. I will try and keep her calm. So what we have within bulk water, what we've developed, and I've indicated what we are developing, I've indicated it in the slide, is an internal task team. And within this task team, we would have various branches within the City of Cape Town. So this idea came about because of the aquifer management in Atlantis, because in Atlantis we use treated stormwater and we use treated wastewater to infiltrate into the aquifer and then abstract it downstream. So that means stormwater plays a role, that means wastewater plays a role. We've got bulk water, of course, and then we've got water demand management, because there are industries also discharging. So there are quite a few internal role players, and each one of them having their own mandate within the City of Cape Town often causes branches to work in silos. So to eliminate the silos, we developed an internal task team in Atlantis, and the same will be done for the Cape Flats Aquifer. Then added to that, because the license for the abstraction of water sits with bulk water, and our mandate is to provide water of sands quality, sand standards to the public. It therefore becomes our responsibility to ensure that water that's being injected into the aquifer and then abstracted downstream adheres to the specific standards. So what we've developed within bulk water is a decision support system. And this decision support system will look at, it will get in data from wastewater. It gets in data even from solid waste, because they've got landfills. It gets in data from stormwater and catchment. And then all the role players, all that data comes to bulk water. It gets added into our database and then gets into the decision support system. We would then have a look at specific triggers, red flags. If there's a red flag, we'd notify them, but they would also have their own system within wastewater. But our system is just to ensure that obviously from bulk water side, that everything is going according to plan. And then I think there was another question about the residential boreholes. So because these residential boreholes, they unfortunately, groundwater is a national resource. So in terms of regulating it, the city can't really do anything. But we do have written into our bylaws that you need to notify the city when you do drill a borehole, and then also when there are certain restrictions imposed within the city of Cape Town, level 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, different bylaws kick in. So at some point you can no longer use your borehole at a specific level. And we all saw that during day zero, there was restrictions, and it said that you are now no longer allowed to use your borehole. And that is because the city will now, because of the drought, start to extract a bigger volume from the aquifers. So we are working on that as well, because it's all new. We are busy working with water demand management and trying to change certain policies, certain bylaws, and that is a work in progress. And then in terms of developments, again, as I've indicated, there's certain things that from bulk water, we can't stop certain developments, and also taking into mind that this is a city that it's been here for a while, so we need developments, we need to grow. But what we do is, if it is a specific development in a specific area, we don't object to the development depending on the activities, but we would say something like advise them to have a stormwater infiltration basin which recharges the aquifer, but the design of that stormwater infiltration basin would first have to come to bulk water. We'd have to assess the design, how they plan to do it, what measures they have in place to ensure that the quality of the water going into the aquifer is of good standards, because obviously we need to ensure that good quality goes into the aquifer and not just anything. So yes, a way forward is that if there are developments, we can encourage them to have stormwater infiltration basins. And I think Kevin through UCT, they are working on a few designs, and they've got a project even with somewhere within the Cape Flats in the Mitchells Plain area, looking at how they are redesigning stormwater ponds to improve the quality of water that goes into the aquifer. Not sure if I got all the questions. Please let me know if I missed one.
Thanks, Candice. Yeah, I guess the Oaklands development is another one of those lemons that have been that you've gotten. Yeah, you've answered the wastewater and sanitation things. There are a few sort of nuanced questions. I think there was a question about whether persistent chemical pollutants are broken down in your treatment system. And what would be the implications if they are not broken down?
So we have been doing a monitoring, and as I've indicated, we've done 2 rounds of CEC samples. The first round wasn't very extensive, and we had that assessment reviewed by an external independent body or person. That person, along with other stakeholders, said that they'd also like, for example, ARVs added, recreational drugs added. So we've added a whole list of pharmaceuticals, drugs, everything has been added to that. And that round of sampling was done in August, the end of August. And we received the lab results. And so the PSP is busy with the analysis of that. So when we receive the analysis, we'll have a look at what we're picking up. Just at first glance, through the lab reports, there's really not much to be stressing about. They all, most of them are below detection limits. And then we'll have a look at that and ensure that, you know, the treatment plant that we propose can eliminate that specific CEC. So they will, obviously, we are doing testing. We will go through that treatment process, have a look at it, sample the water of the treated water to ensure that the specific CECs that we are picking up in various well fields have been eliminated. But this is also, again, ongoing. So we continue to do the monitoring, and we'll continue and we'll see if we are picking up anything else other than what we've identified in the last round.
Well, thanks, Candice. And Karen has just reminded me about her question on the enforcement and implementation mechanisms that are used by the City of Cape Town to protect the groundwater protection zone. So I know that you said that you are sort of in the process of developing bylaws, etc. But is there anything that the City of Cape Town is relying on at the moment?
Corinne, I'm not sure, but for example, we have included it in the municipal framework and in the district and municipal spatial development frameworks. So with the spatial development and land use planning, they send us also comments or proposed developments, and then we say that this specific development falls within zone 2, and the activities that they are proposing in this development is a filling station, and we then further with the PSP, we ask them either to model the scenario or something, look at it and see, is there a high risk? Should we object, or should we say they can continue? However, you need to either change your design of the storage tanks, having abundant area, or I don't know, whatever, however you would be designing this the system, and then also including monitoring, and of course, if we feel that you know, more things need to be done, or there are specific listed activities with DWS, we then advise that they go to DWS. But that's all we've got for now. Yes, as I've indicated, we are looking at the bylaws, and then in terms of our resilience department, they are looking at a groundwater strategy for the city of Cape Town and trying to get that, and that will be included in this groundwater strategy for the city of Cape Town. But it is all work in progress. If you do have any suggestions or recommendations, please let me know. So yeah, that's all we're doing for now.
Cool, thank you very much, Candice. Nazir asked where exactly in the well fields in Strandfontein are, but I think you've answered that. I think you did have a map up indicating the location of the well fields, am I right?
Yes, that's correct. And Nazir, you can pop me a WhatsApp if you want to, you know, if you want me to go with you and show you the area, we can do that. But there was a map.
Great, thanks so much, Candice, and thank you very much to all of the speakers. I know Kevin and Alan unfortunately have had to leave. Yeah, and thank you to all the participants, and thanks so much to everyone who made some time to listen to us speak about the aquifer.